For our first extra credit, we wanted to talk about lazy state initialization. So let's explain why that is necessary. So every time our greeting component runs, this useState call is going to run, and we're passing the initial value that we want React useState to use for the first time that this runs, but then thereafter, useState actually ignores that first argument. It just doesn't care because it's no longer the initial value, and now it's just we're re-rendering, and we are maintaining that value of state over time internally inside of React. So it doesn't care what we pass as the initial value because it's no longer initial anyway. So that's normally fine because like creating a 0 and passing that as an argument is pretty cheap. But this window local storage get item call can be kind of an expensive call. It's a synchronous call that we're going into local storage to pull something out of. And so in some situations, this could be a performance bottleneck. And we can actually prove this. Let me go ahead and console log here. We'll say we're rendering, and then I'll look at my output here. We're seeing that we're rendering, and every character that I type, we're getting another render, which is not great for our performance because every single time we type a character, we're reading out of local storage, but we don't need to because we already did that the first time. We don't actually care about that value thereafter. And so what we need to do is we need to somehow lazily read into this local storage and say, hey, React, that's cool that you want to get this initial value. Can you instead maybe call a function that I'm going to pass to you so that you can get that initial value and then not call it when you don't need the initial value? And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm going to make a function here called getInitialNameValue, and we're going to just move this into that function. We'll return that, and then we'll pass that function here. So defining the function, like that's pretty cheap, but calling the function, that's kind of expensive. And so by putting it inside of this function, we're saying, hey, I'm going to define this function every render. Who cares? Really cheap. But I only want you to call that function when you actually need that initial value, which is exactly what React does. So we can leave this console log for rendering here. We'll add a console log for getting initial value right here. And then we'll see that we get our rendering, getting initial value. And then as I'm typing, we'll see we get just a rendering, but we're no longer getting that initial value. So we've gotten some good value, no pun intended. Actually, the pun was totally intended, but we're getting some value out of putting this stuff into a function so we don't have to read into local storage every single time our greeting component updates. And now to take this a step further, I actually don't normally create a function like this. I normally will just inline that function in that useState call. So that's what we're going to do. We'll make an arrow function that just implicitly returns that value. It's a lot simpler and we get the same benefit. So in review, we actually didn't do a whole lot. Let's just take a look at before and after. Ta-da! That's literally the only change that we made here is we took this out of the render phase and put it into the lazy state initialization phase, so that this function is defined every render, but who cares? That's really cheap, really easy. It's only called when we actually need that initial value, which is only when this greeting component is rendered in the first place. So this is a nice optimization that the useState hook exposes for us, but I wouldn't do this all the time. Like if we really only cared about that initial name, there's no way you're going to get me to create a function for that. It's super cheap to just pass that initial name. In fact, it's more expensive to create the function than just to pass the initial name. Or if it was just a number or an empty string or something, none of those things are really all that big of a deal. So I don't actually often use this lazy initialization feature, pretty much only when I'm doing something that is computationally expensive and I don't want it to run every single render.